Alrighty, guys, I am going to try my hand at a second attempt at the West Marches style campaign. And I've learned a lot of lessons from my last attempt and the last couple of campaigns and or just RPG experiences I've had recently in the past in general. And I'm just going to talk through my thought process here about what I've learned and what I plan on changing in my future next iteration of the West Marches campaign. So, the biggest thing that I think I've sort of had as like an experience at this point is trying one of those powered by the apocalypse, Blades in the Dark, rules light games. And I think my general conclusion on them is that I don't exactly think that they are for me and or my group. So the reason that I really got interested in trying the rules light game, right, is because of some of the like feedback that I'd received. Always trying to do like at the end of my sessions during the D&D campaign, asking the like, what do you guys want to see more of or less of, and what are the things that you liked and what are the things that you didn't like. And the general reoccurring answer that I've generally heard was that people were a fan of the story aspect of the game, that they liked the story that was being told. And I took that to mean as like, okay, well, let's go all in on that then. And in our next campaign, let's play a game that is entirely focused just on creating as great of a story as possible. And well, looking back on it now, I think I've come to realize that those very broad, vague sort of questions are probably not the greatest to ask to get specific feedback to change things about the campaign. I think in the future, when I try to get player feedback, I will ask like much more specific questions. Because I do think that people are both primed and biased to like give story being their favorite aspect of the game. Obviously me as the DM who has talked about the RPGs in general. I want to hear story being told as the answer, and I think when people just from like media and given like context, they understand that the point, the thing you're supposed to get out of RPGs as opposed to other games is that they tell a story. So people are ready to give that as their answer. So, but like the powered by the apocalypse, I like the idea of it, and there are definitely nice things about it. I do think generally when it comes to like dramatic and or plot developments per session or per hour, if you were to like record that, you would see that Powered by the Apocalypse games just have a much higher proportion, a higher like frequency of that occurring, as opposed to like the classic crunchy D&D type of game. But I couldn't help but feel the entire way of the through, like that entire campaign and every session and every encounter and every role, even, that every single moment that occurred just rung very hollow because nothing ever really felt like it was occurring because that was staying consistent within the rules of the universe and of the tone of the story and everything that we have been telling. Right, like for example, in D&D, you know that when you roll damage and you reduce a guy to zero, you know that that is a reflection of how the world works and that that means that that guy is now dead. Whereas in Powered by the Apocalypse, when you like overcame an encounter and or if you succeeded enough times, then that meant that this encounter was like over for a reason, and then it was up to me as the DM to decide whether or not it's because these guys ran away or because because you killed them or gotten like incapacitated them, and or any combination of us working together to like me and the players deciding what would be the most dramatic thing to happen in this moment. And it just made everything feel undramatic because everything was happening because I or someone decided that that's the thing that would happen. There was just I feel like you really need that degree of separation to maintain that level of suspension of disbelief, which I think was just missing. I could not get into it. I could not immerse myself into the world because I knew we were just like it was too obvious that we were just playing make believe, which at the end of the day you are just doing in D&D too, but the amount of rules and numbers that are over everything can kind of trick you into thinking that that this stuff is actually happening. At least, again, in my personal experience, that is what I felt like I experienced. But I digress. Okay. So I do think I'm going to. In the past, I really try to lean into trying to recreate the feeling of a TV show and having those moments of like, your father shows up, is today's episode going to be a story of how you learn to reconnect with your estranged father, or are we going to learn a lesson about how you sometimes acts are so unkind that they are unforgivable? And that's how I went into my previous sessions with that kind of mindset of like, here's my sort of plot that I ideally want me and my players to explore. But again, it felt very artificial and forced and inorganic, which just made everything feel kind of weird and clunky. So I think I'm going to do the complete opposite in this next campaign and almost go for the mechanically inclined, like video game angle perception for each of my sessions. Okay. Also, just in general, now this is possibly pertaining to all RPGs, but very much so specifically D&D. The three pillars of play that you'll sometimes hear about: the combat, the social, and the exploration. And I have gone deep, 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 deep into trying to make both my combat and social encounters as efficient as possible, as meaningful as possible, as interesting and unique and creative as possible. I've like done so much time trying to research into how other people make those types of encounters fun. But I just completely ignored exploration. I just kind of figured like, well, that's just naturally gonna come up a as like just a consequence in being in a new world. Like exploration will just happen. But I honestly, I think now looking back on it, especially specifically from the perspective of the West Marches style type of game, I'm gonna go much much deeper into really trying to master the pillar of exploration. That is at least going to be the purpose of what I'm going to try to learn from this next venture. So I've decided, like, I've considered that these are going to be the three of the big things I'm going to try to the three lessons that I've learned from what I've consumed to try to implement into this next game. So for one, open world games and like landmark goals. I've definitely fallen into the trap in the past of making all types of goals, trying to lean towards the story based, like character driven type of angle, and just 100% focusing on that and thinking that's like the only thing that matters is like the character. But I was watching like a video discussing like Elden Ring and open world games in general, and it did lead me to believe that there's like I definitely learned that like there's more motivations than just trying to continue like a character driven plot that can be truly compelling. Like just for example, Elden Ring, right? When you get out of the tutorial area and you just see in the horizon that giant glowing golden tree, immediately your thought is like, well, I think it would be cool if I could walk up to that tree and see what's there and you like look at the map and you see that the map is big enough that yeah, you will eventually walk up to that tree and get there. And I on just playing the video game, I found that truly compelling. Like I that motivated me to play through like a majority of the game, just to see what cool stuff was probably in that tree. Whereas if it were a more classic, you are just told that the Elden Beast murdered your family and you're on a mission for revenge, you already know, well, okay, yeah, I guess eventually I'm going to get there and eventually reach the Elden Beast and succeed in, getting revenge against this guy. Or at best, you find that there's some sort of plot twist, memento. Oh my god, you were the bad guy the whole time. You actually were the crazy one who killed your own family. And if that's the case, then I'm like, well, I am already considering that as another angle, and I'm not going to be surprised by that at all. But just walking up to a random golden giant tree far off in the distance, that could be literally anything. So basically, this next campaign, I'm going to very, very much so try to get player motivation coming from the idea of exploration and just seeing what cool stuff is out there and giving just enough hints to like tantalize people to want to know more and not go for the angle of like there is a big bad evil guy who you guys all have motivations to want to stop for reasons. Another thing that I've been considering, the just exploring all the various different actual plays that exist there. Like time and time again, I come to the conclusion that like Dimension 20 has got the only one, or it's the only one that has like combats that actually are able to keep my intention and interest me from beginning to end. And obviously they've got like production value with like cameras and cool set pieces and all their made terrain and models and everything, which is certainly a part of it that I think I can do a little bit to try to recreate in like the terrain making aspect, that department. But primarily, I think the main thing that goes on is the constantly evolving combats, like that one Halo game. But yeah, just that idea of just like every round or every 2 rounds, like someone is showing up or some new element is getting added, some new thing to consider is getting thrown in there, and it basically very rarely ever devolves into a real slog fest where you were just hitting each other back and forth, which I find the vast majority of D&D combats and any other, both in just campaigns that I've played, I've run, and or just watched as actual plays, there's certainly a tendency for that to occur. And I think you definitely need to put in a lot of effort to make sure that stuff like that does not happen. The other thing that I want to take away from Blades in the Dark is the idea of like the session phases. I was kind of questionable. I wasn't sure. I was kind of hesitant, suspicious of that idea because it did seem very restrictive in a game that is all about complete and utter freedom. But I think it'll be helpful, especially for the West Marches style campaigns, where I can sort of set this routine for both myself and the players to have adventures start with the exciting stuff, start off with the fighting and the exploration and the stuff where you can very easily transition from like a board game and or video game mindset into like interacting with the world. And then once you've been playing for an hour or two and or you've been eased into it by just rolling dice and killing monsters, then you'll probably be more in the D&D mindset at that point and be willing to pretend to talk like a wizard, once we've reached the like point where you are back in town and or doing all your socializing and interacting with NPCs and all of that stuff. So I am gonna try to sort of maintain some sort of session phase of like, we get to the table, do the combat, then it's phase 2, that's back in town do the RP stuff. Which for a traditional D&D campaign you probably don't need so much, but I think for West Marches where we have to pick up with potentially random people at the start of each session, I think this will be a very useful tool. Okay, so now a little bit more into the nitty gritty as to how I plan on specifically enacting sessions during this new campaign. Um, so before the session, we will determine what hex people want to explore. I think I've actually decided to change this, but ideally, there will be like some sort of small landmark, or like as an example, there might be a small landmark that's like there is peasants talking about rumors of a witch's hut that is 3 hexes or whatever it ends up being, like 12 miles away. And then the players will decide before the session, let's go there. Then, before the session starts, before people arrive, I, the DM, will go to my 6x4 table and create a like an arrangement of terrain with various encounters all where this landmark is. Then we do whatever random encounters and or traveling stuff is necessary to get to that landmark, and then we get into the players exploring that area with minis on the table, walking around, doing a sort of like if we have both the macro version of exploration, which would be the giant hex map of the many miles, then this would be the sort of micro version of that exploration where you're just walking around that 6x4 table with your minis and like going into various little places that I've prepared and looking around them and gathering whatever treasure or fighting whatever encounters are there. So I did create a little diagram. I don't think you're going to be able to see this on camera at all, but as an example as to what this might look like. So, for example, you might have like I would probably take the 6x4 table and break it up into 6 2x2 quadrants. One of those quadrants being where the players are going to start off, and then there will be a number of other quadrants, or I guess at sextants or something. I don't know what the proper term would that be. Okay, but other areas where encounters are located. So here there is a river that is running through the whole thing. That would be like the main natural feature that is present. There might be a bridge, and under that bridge is a troll. So if the players go there, they might get surprised and get ambushed or something. They'll probably want to do some sneaking and exploring before then. Across the bridge is a forest with an elf ranger that is just out hunting. So maybe the players decide, maybe they find that the troll is there, they see that, so they're like, well, let's get to the trees. We can climb up, use that as a vantage point to shoot down on the troll. But in the forest, there is an elf who is there hunting, and they might be able to talk to that elf, possibly convince him to help the party, or for whatever reason, due to whatever previous experiences or circumstances, or maybe even factions that the players reveal themselves to be a part of, the elf might turn into an enemy. Across from the elf in the forest, there are dwarves panning for gold in the river. So again, there might be an interaction where the players decide to either team up with this elf against these dwarves, or they talk to these dwarves and decide that this elf is a threat for whatever reason. Or maybe they are able to convince these two parties to work together. And otherwise, down the river, they see like an abandoned fishing boat that they might be able to go for to try to use to sail down the rest of the river, potentially making future exploration even easier for them. There, they would get ambushed by some Sahwagan waiting in the water. And all the way at the other end is the witch's hut. Maybe they decide they need to go to this hut first and think that there might be some potions in there to use to help them fight some of these other encounters, or vice versa. They decide to clear out some of these other encounters so that they can set up a proper choke point. Like maybe they want to take out the bridge first so they can sort of funnel in whatever nasties might be coming out of that witch's hut. I just think that this could be a very interesting idea of going about a adventure. It's basically just a dungeon, but without separated rooms and without separated walls. So there's the chance that you might get ganged up on very quickly and have to skedaddle on out of there. Or you might start a fight and it gets loud and other people decide to run away because they don't want to, get involved. So I think it could be very neat to just display everything, give like a visual tool that players can use to consider how they want to go about dealing with these various encounters, and just showing them off the bat that there are these multiple encounters around for them to potentially try to use like against each other and or with each other. I think it'll, if it works right, if I do it right, I think it will display like the best parts of D&D, which is just being able to mess with things in such a way that the DM never even considered or prepared for. I think this will like make that as easy to do as possible with this setup. I should add, this is an extremely bare bones, slap together in 30 seconds example. A fully fleshed out version of this map would include the various loot carried and or found in all the different places, and all the little secrets hidden around in all the nooks and crannies, and the names and motivations and such of the various entities that are hanging out there, all the set dressing and little environmental effects and tiny little toys to play with. The full version would be very, very like extensive. It would at least probably fill up that one page full of text instead of just one word being written in each quadrant hextant. Anyway, also for the starting town for the like campaign as a whole, I've decided to super duper duper scale down and make very tiny. Instead of having the church and all the like 5 things that you would normally have as the bare bones minimum requirement in the town, the church and whatever for the cleric to interact in or whatever, I would want just the absolute bare necessities, the inn to rest in, and the trading post for you to sell all your crap. And I want the town to otherwise be completely, fully modular in the sense that the players will have the opportunity to expand it however they see fit. And instead of having a town already with a church, and then when they build their church, it's like just another church in the town, right? I want it to be a very central, important location in that town, which, I think, I don't think other people have necessarily expressed an interest in a base building aspect of D&D, but I am really, I'm going to try to push it again this time, see if we can get that going. Okay. So traveling through hexes, something that I'm still kind of iffy about is how I want to handle random encounters. Now, random encounters I want to use as a means to incentivize people to try to take out close landmarks first, and not just session 1 travel halfway across the world to just go to some far off landmark, because with each hex that you'll travel through, there will either be a chance or perhaps even a guarantee that a random encounter will occur. And random encounters, so I want them to prevent people from going too far. So the mechanical purpose that they would like serve to function as is just to reduce people's resources, just to like take away people's health points or spell slots or what have you. So ideally, I want them to be solvable very quickly, and not with having to break out, 5 wolf minis and break out all the players' minis and get into grid combat. So I've been playing around with the idea of almost those like roguelike game events, like when you're playing Rogue Slay the Spire, and you're like going down that tree branch and like just you get into one of those things, or like FTL, when you like run into one of them aliens on an asteroid or whatever, and just deciding like how you want to go about dealing with it, and just having like a single role resolving the entire random encounter. Now, obviously, this gets very dicey in D&D because the whole point is that like, well, when the bandits, they're walking down the road and they walk into bandits, and uh I would present this as like a, well, what do you guys want to do? As these bandits are stopping you and demanding your money. And then it would be like up to the like I would have prepared, I would have written like, here is the role if they want to sneak by. Here is the role if they want to try to talk them down. Here is the role if they want to attack them. Like, here's the DCs for all those things. But though obviously with D&D, things can get very, who knows what the players will do when those bandits show up, and how it will entirely not work with whatever DCs I've prepared. And like it also, like I could see this just coming across as very inconsistent with how, well, why is like combat should always be handled the same way. Like, why is it that when we get into a combat with these goblins on the map in this exploration phase, we fight them, but when we get into this combat with goblins on the road, we just make a single roll? Which certainly, I don't know. I can see the argument against it. So this whole situation, this is going to be more experimental. I'm going to give it a try. I don't know if it's actually going to work out. This very well might be on the cutting board though. Okay. And factions. So another thing that I think I've realized with my last D&D campaign in particular was I really wanted to go deep on the politics angle, which I think I've sort of come to learn that that is more of a late stage D&D interest than a early player kind of thing to get people involved in. Okay, so what do I mean by that? By that I mean when you're like a late stage D&D player, when you've got like 20 campaigns under your belt, you get to the point where you're like, okay, I just want to see how much of an effect I can have on the world, like just how much I can really mess things up. And that kind of becomes the fun of the game, and you realize that like, okay, well, the best way to have the greatest impact on the world is by getting involved in politics and totally shaping countries' borders, and just destroying entire factions and creating entire factions and all of that jazz. And for the vast majority of my players, this was either like one of, if not the first actual attempt that they've ever had at trying to play in a real full campaign. And I definitely should have just focused on broadly making the experience and the campaign as like fun as possible for everyone, rather than trying to funnel people into this type of campaign to try to create the type of campaign that I personally myself would have had the most fun with. And yeah, so in the last campaign, I started to try to create this situation where players would have to go around and align all these various lords and dukes and nobles to work together to fight this undead threat, very a la Game of Thrones kind of situation. This time I'm gonna dial back the politics a whole lot. I still want to have factions in play that will still just be on like a macro sense, kind of something to interact with from an RP roleplay angle once you're back in town dealing with various representatives. And I like the idea that these factions can both be jumping off points to base various landmarks off of. Like they can just be either bases of operations for the various factions, and then dealing with them in various means will either like raise or lower your reputation with them. And I do think at some point, if there is something like a big bad evil guy of the campaign, I would want him to kind of be determined by this faction play. So if the players decide that there's a particular faction that they dislike and or that they've been getting into a lot of conflict with, then that would make it easy for me to set up the leader of that faction as the big bad evil guy and create what I hope will be a very organic feeling story where like the threat and the enemy is actually determined by the players and their histories and personalities and all of that. Some more stuff that I think. So now we're sort of just getting into the changes that I want to make towards my homebrew system. Clocks, I think I'm just going to introduce as a visual way to represent, like, hey guys, this is how close you guys are to either running away from this encounter or completing whatever skill challenge. Like all skill challenge type stuff will be handled with clocks. I like retreating and factions. Yeah, okay. I think I'm going to just completely get rid of the idea of advantage and disadvantage, which I do think it serves its function as being just a very simple way of handling when people should be in a situation where a thing would likely be easier to complete for them. So I generally get the sense that this is more of a new player D&D kind of thing where it's very simple, and it just makes logical, intuitive sense, but there's very little room for nuance in the advantage disadvantage system. So I'm gonna go more into that 3.5 Pathfinder direction of every single little advantage you get, everything that does help you, will give you a bonus to your roll, and you want to try to just stack as many of them on to themselves as possible without like as opposed to the like, well, you can have 5 instances of advantage, but it all still just counts as having a single just advantage. And in order to make stacking all those bonuses matter, I'm going to steal the Pathfinder 2nd edition idea of if you do incredibly well on a check, like if you roll an 18, but you have plus 10 to the check, if that brings you over 10 of the difficulty, then you get a crit. Then you like get that critical extra bonus function. Okay, next, massive damage. So before, lingering injuries occurred every single time you were reduced to 0. Now lingering injuries will only ever occur when you take a lot of damage in a single hit. But every time you get reduced to 0, you will be accruing that trauma, which I think in 1D&D, the latest iteration, I think they were going with you gaining levels of exhaustion, which gives you -1 to all your rolls for each level you have, which I think makes sense, and I think is a good solution to that sort of rubber banding problem in D&D, where you can just like come back to life over and over in a combat, and you should always just save your healing spells until people go unconscious. But I feel like this will still be enough of a penalty where like this will be a long lasting kind of thing that you will eventually have to deal with without it being like an annoying thing that kind of like nerfs your character for the rest of the session. Okay, so spell list. So I really tried doing that Mage the Ascension and or that like Pathfinder Spheres of Power, Words of Power, whatever it is, the very customized spells with no real spell list. But I've just like it's not intuitive. I've realized the idea of like people inventing this spell. Like I think that would work well for that more rules light type of game. But here you need to have concrete numbers written out, and I generally realize that like when people went to interact with that Mage the Ascension sort of format of spells, it was mainly in the form of people trying to ask and figure out what the D&D equivalents of all of these mage spheres would be. So it's like, all right, well, at this point I might as well cut out the middleman and just go right back to the classic D&D spells thing. So I have been trying to do mana and or spell points, which I have certainly found a real problem with, and that's, if a player gets 30 mana and a fifth level spell costs like 6 mana or something, if they have the ability to, they are just going to cast like 6 or 5, I guess, fifth level spells instead of mixing it up, which I initially thought that giving people mana and the ability to spend this mana however they want, I thought it would add to like versatility and like how much unique sort of ways we saw casters working. But in reality, the complete opposite happened, where you just only ever cast however many of like the highest level spells that you could. So yeah, it ended up having the complete opposite effect. I do still believe though that the mana system is just much more intuitive. Like it just makes a lot more sense that you have an amount of mana and each spell has a cost of mana, and when you run out, you're done for the day. Rather than this very unique to D&D strange spell slot system, which I do now realize actually does lead to much more varied and interesting play by the wizard. So my newest take is, well, what I'm going to try is doing the mana approach with your spells and having a spell list, but only being able to cast each spell a single time between each time you rest. Kind of like that real classic ye old fire and forget Vancian take on Magic. So again, this is kind of experimental. Very well might change. Like maybe I might just go back entirely to classic D&D spell slots, but I'll try this new unique take on mana and spells. Okay, leveling up. So I do think I might just, I think I'm just gonna do this for features. Like when every time in my system when someone reaches level 3 and they get to pick a unique feature, I am going to give them 2 options to choose from instead of handing them the book and then telling them like pick one of these from this list of 150 or whatever. And I hope that what this will lead to is either it being interesting, either seeing what I as the DM think would make sense as a feature to gain from either how you've been role playing and or how you've been handling situations, or like incentivizing people if they have a specific feature that they have in mind that they want to get, then incentivizing them to actually play and role play in such a way where that would be one of the options given to them. So hopefully that works out. Again, this is another kind of experimental one. This might get nixed too. Okay. Destiny points. So I tried doing the thing in my last campaign where you have these Destiny points, which are kind of like the DC Adventures hero points. When you use them, you basically get a super reroll, like a reroll with a +10 bonus. And I tried attaching this to the ambitions that you complete in a way to incentivize people to always try to work towards completing the goals that they have set before themselves. Instead, this kind of had a not that effect in the sense that this more so just incentivized people to give themselves the most simple and straightforward basic ambitions they possibly could, so that they would know that they could achieve it, so that they know that they would get their destiny point back. So that ended up backfiring a bit. I was playing with the idea of giving a destiny point to everyone at the beginning of every session, but I think that just it trivializes too much in the sense that like the first four important roles of every single session, people will just know that like, well, if I need be, I can just spend a destiny point and I'll just get it back next time and just bip bop away. It removes the stakes from those very important roles that usually don't come up that frequently over sessions anyway. My argument, my thought process though, for giving everyone the destiny point is that everyone can guarantee that they can at least have the spotlight at least once a session by making sure that they are passing at least one important check. So I'm going to sort of do like a little bit of a compromise here, meet in the middle, and give people their destiny point back on level up. So that is much more of a like a bit more of a rare resource that you might be getting once every 2, 3, 4, maybe even 5 sessions, which will basically guarantee that you'll at least have the spotlight once per level, and you'll also be incentivized to level up even more, which obviously everyone already is, because that's like the main thing that you get for playing the game. But this would just be even more of a reason to want to try to level up. But I still think it'll be infrequent enough, yeah, that you'll really have to think about when, where, and when you want to spend it. Okay, reaction rolls. I'm definitely gonna just steal that from the ye old D&D and or GURPS. I think they're a great idea for reasons that I've previously discussed in other videos, but this will be the first time that I actively implement them into one of my campaigns. Fighter, I'm going to break up into both Man at Arms, who is specifically going to be the core basic default melee class, and then Targeteer, who will be the ranged class, especially just because technology wise, I am going to move a bit further into like that Renaissance angle than classic D&D, so there will be like muskets around, and I kind of want there to be a class available for the gunslinger archetype, the classic like musketeer kind of guy. Ability scores. So ability scores, they are a relic from the past. Basically, the fact that you have your 1 to 20 sort of score, and then that determines your modifier, and then the modifier is the actually relevant one. One of those skeuomorphs from a past age, back from when in D&D you would just roll a single d20, and then if you got under your score, then you succeeded, which is why they went from like 1 to 20. But I just like, you don't need it anymore. Like I get the purpose of it is it is now in the vocabulary of D&D players. Now people understand, when you say your character is a strength 18 guy, that means that he is like an Arnold Schwarzenegger type of strength level of guy. So I get why it's still relevant, why D&D keeps it around, and all the various different like variations of the types of D&D game that have come out. But I've decided I'm just going to scrap them because they only ever, at least in my experience, lead to more confusion than anything else, especially with new players. So there will be tons of little changes that have to come with this, like ability score damage, but I don't think it'll be too huge of a problem. I think this is just a, since we're going to be making so many other various of the aspects of the game kind of more complicated, wherever I can make it more simple, I want to take advantage of making those things as simple as I can. Okay, so armor class. This has just been a little pet peeve of mine regarding D&D. I do not like the fact at all that the super dexterous backflipping monk mechanically functions the same way as the heavy plate mail wearing knight guy does. So I've decided armor class. I'm going to split this up into your dodge and your damage reduction, much like either GURPS or Warhammer Fantasy roleplay, or actually a lot of like role playing games. So your dodge will be your flat foot AC, or is it the opposite of flat foot AC? I forget now. But it'll oh yeah, I guess yeah, no, not your flat foot AC. Whatever the other one is. But yeah, your dodge will just be your straight up like dex. That will be your ability to actively not get hit by people, and then your damage reduction will be however much your armor provides. So, dodging and or being a tank as a monk will feel very different as being a tank from like a knight or a fighter or whatever. And I just think this will create some more interesting choices regarding armor, whether or not you want the actual heaviest armor or not. But so I did try implementing DR as like I did try this system earlier in my campaign and eventually moved away from it, mainly because of this one reason that the monk with a bunch of small hits just gets instantly nullified by an armor wearing opponent, which I think in reality makes sense. That if all you're doing is walking up to a dude and punching him, if he is wearing a full plate of armor, it makes sense that you just deal very little to no damage every time you attack him. But gameplay wise, that is extraordinarily unfun for your character to just be incapable of doing damage against a possible opponent. But I have since considered a much easier solution to this problem that I think actually makes a lot of sense. And that is just the fact that I'm going to have grappling kind of be expanded in its functionality to not just prevent movement from a person, but also to prevent them from effectively using their armor for damage reduction. Which again, I think just makes logical sense that if you were a monk and you were fighting a full plate armor knight, you wouldn't just punch him a lot. That would be very ineffective. You would do a lot more if you were able to grab him and force him to the ground and grab him by the back of his gorget and just yank it into his throat until he stops breathing. Whereas like in D&D, there's kind of ways you can go about doing that with the whole I forget what there's some like improved grapple feat that gives you the ability to like choke people out, but I think it would make more sense if that is just a default means of how grappling works. And I think it'll also make combat just more interesting, like melee combat, that sometimes you do actually want to just grapple dudes just for future bonuses. And I think that lines up better with reality anyway. I think monks as martial artists should be grappling dudes way more often. I can't help but feel like trying to fight another guy with a sword pretty much as though you're like dueling him with a sword, but you're just using your fists. I don't know, maybe leans a little bit into the cartoony, which I guess again you can interpret D&D however you want, as just saying like, oh well, I know I'm rolling these d6s for unarmed damage for my unarmed strikes, but this is actually representative of me choking him out. Or yeah, like I guess that works, but I don't know. I'm curious to try this out. I think this will solve my issues with the damage reduction armor. The other thing is with like giant monsters, like a giant dragon with thick, scaly hide. Again, I don't think it really makes sense that a monk would punch him and do damage. But if the monk were to climb on top of that dragon and get on its neck and behind its head and start gouging its eyes out, that I think would make sense, and I think would be a reasonable way to ignore the dragon's damage reduction. And I just generally think that that would be cooler and more dynamic in combat. So that's how I plan on handling both damage reduction for small armored guys and big, thick hide armored monsters. So combat modifiers. Don't know exactly how I'm going to handle grappling yet. If I want to do the 5e, it's just an athletics check, or if I want to do the more Pathfinder, you have a specific combat modifier score that you use. This I will figure out and before the next session for sure. Okay, so these are examples of the types of encounters that I might have on one of these various explorable tables. By tables, I don't mean charts, I mean a straight up actual plank of wood with a bunch of terrain and stuff on it. And again, I think it'll just be cool that you can have them all interact with each other immediately and, sort of mess around. I like the idea of both the macro sandbox of the great map you can explore in any which way and go to any of these giant landmarks that are particularly like intriguing to you. And then we have the micro sandbox where there's just all these tiny little encounters placed on the same one board for you to try to play with to like have them mess with each other however you see fit. Okay, for character backstories, another thing that I'm just gonna do a little bit of a change of for how we create characters. So I strayed away from the bonds, ideals, flaws, and stuff, which I like as concepts. I don't know if they like I don't know if they 100% succeeded in their purpose, which I think the idea, or at least what I liked, the what you could potentially get out of Bond's flaws and personality traits and all that stuff was the was using it as a prompt for you to role play. Like when you interact with an NPC or whatever, you can use your bonds as a jumping off point to talk to this guy. Which again, good in theory. I like the concept, but I think it could be done even better. So my most recent take on this is I want to try to use instead of like bonds, flaws, yada yada. We're going to be going off of opinions on recent events. So opinions on either specific people who are important and or specific people who are just around and or opinions on things that have occurred recently and, or potentially even like historically. And then when you interact with people, much more like a natural conversation. People don't tend to talk about their hamartias and their personality traits when in a conversation, but making conversation with like a stranger or something and then talking about your actual thoughts on tangible things that have occurred, that I think could come up much more frequently and would be a much more natural way to get people talking to NPCs about things that matter in the world. An ambition, that's pretty much, I'm just going to concern myself with people's long term ambition as opposed to dealing with people's short term ambitions. Okay, so death. Now, last time in my last campaign, I was very coy. I was very, oh no, well, I don't want people to quit if they die, so I'm just going to say death doesn't actually really matter. And if you die, you just come back at the same level and no, nothing lost. You just come back from where you were. Nah. None of that. I think I've gained at least enough confidence from my last campaign that I am willing to stand firm on this idea of like death is brutal. You really, really do not want it to happen. You really want to try to avoid it. Which, on the one hand, you do incentivize people to play very safe and potentially incentivize people to play in ways that are very unfun and very boring. But on the other hand, I think it'll make up for all of that in the fact that all of the consequences and stakes will seem 100 times more real and important. If you have to start over from scratch, you are really gonna want to not have your character die, and God forbid your character does die, you're really gonna feel it and you're really gonna care. Um, yeah, I'm gonna ideally not. I don't want to end up in one of these situations where someone is like, "Oh yeah, I'm just gonna I'll sacrifice my character here," and then when people ask like, "Oh my God, are you sure?" It's like, "Yeah, it's fine. Like I want to make a wizard anyway. I want to go test that out. Yeah, I'll just." It's cool. It's dramatic. But yeah, my character will sacrifice himself here. It's whatever. No. when a character sacrifices themselves, I want there to be like real like gasps and real like questions of like, oh my god, are you sure you want to do that? Because now it'll actually have meaning when someone sacrifices themselves. They genuinely are losing real time that they have spent at multiple sessions, uh, like accruing everything that they have for that character. And people have played roguelikes before, and people don't fall into shambles every single time their Binding of Isaac run ends because they die and have to start over from the start. That being said, I'm going to absolutely nullify everything I literally just said by now saying that I definitely am still going to keep resurrection as an option available to people. But it's going to both be not 100%. There will be the chance of failing when you resurrect. This will actually just be the same from my last system, but I think it'll be more relevant and actually come up this time. Resurrection is definitely also going to be expensive. So people will have the option when they come in with their new level 1 character, they can just start with that straight up motivation and that thought of like, okay, I know I need to make X amount of thousands of gold so that I can try to resurrect my last character who just died. But again, there'll still be that penalty, and that again, it might just fail, and also that you'll lose like however many sessions with your old guy that you are now having to play with the new guy. Um, I can't imagine that this will be a very popular rule among players. I think people will. I genuinely, honestly, do not know. I know whenever I've brought up the ideas of harsh death penalties in the past, people did not seem particularly excited. But it doesn't help that I think I started like introducing these things, and or started talking about those consequences once people got really attached to their characters, which I think is very much so the kind of thing that you need to make front and center straight from the beginning, not try to bring it up in the middle of a campaign. But yeah, I think like I think this is just like a necessary thing for especially for like a West Marches style campaign to really feel like it has stakes if there's otherwise no overarching plot to potentially lose in. Those stakes need to be character based. Also, just in general, I plan on making the idea of the stable of characters like a much more concrete element of the campaign that will occur much more frequently this time. Like player characters might actually get captured and or injured for extended periods of time in which they actually need to play someone else until such time that they can either rescue or have their other character recover fully, get a little bit of that XCOM-y sort of feeling integrated into the game. Okay, so just this is just a quick little thing as to how I think I would run, like mechanically speaking, like pragmatically, one of those exploration phases of the players on the board. Players, I would basically they see the whole board, they tell me the thing that they want to interact with or the thing that they want to do first, and I just tell them how far they get into that process before they get stopped by either an enemy interrupting them or other environmental condition from that board stopping them, and only ever going into initiative when need be, and otherwise trying to blend that combat and that like non-combat means of like I don't know how seamless it'll honestly feel. This again, this was just me brainstorming how I will logistically actually do this. Okay, so recap videos. So something that possibly the most useful thing that I have come to figure out from the previous sort of campaigns that I've both run, played, just have watched in general. Notes, I think I've landed on them being pretty much a necessary part of the player experience. In my first whole campaign and the last campaign that I both ran, I was very light on trying to enforce people note taking because I was like, all right, I'm making these videos anyway. If you need to refresh on what has happened so far, you can just watch those instead. You don't really need to worry about taking notes. But I've realized that they are actually an extraordinarily important in game, at the table tool for you to look through and actually be able to have like this continuity of things in the past mattering and actually having the whole fun aspect of RPGs in general of like, oh, I'm having an effect on the world, right? Like the easiest way to see that and to interact with that and all of that is by checking your notes and seeing how you can use things in the past that have occurred that might be helpful right now, and or like how things you are doing right now might influence and interact those things that have just happened, that you have in your notes from a while ago. And also, it just like in those role play and or any non-combat situation, it actually actively gives you a thing to do, which is read through and look at your notes. So yeah, if you don't take away anything else from this, if you were just randomly perusing this and you somehow got an hour into it, definitely take away that notes are vital for the role play experience. Another thing I want to say about the recap videos and all that. At some point, I eventually started including like lore tidbits into those videos. I've decided instead I'm going to start making some shorts for the next campaign and just create quick little easily consumable and digestible 1 minute videos explaining of various factions and areas and important people and happenings and all of that jazz, the gods and all that. And I like the shorts format, honestly. It's both that sort of restriction of the 1 minute time limit is honestly kind of helpful for the creative process, because you're not allowed to ramble in those. You actually have to like prepare a script and be very intentional with everything you say. And they're just I think they'll be a lot easier for players to actually get into their system and into their brain if they just if they could just watch 10 minutes of shorts or whatever and be totally up to date with everything that's going on in the in-game world. I think it'll be fun. Okay, so more mechanic stuff that I'm planning on changing. Initiative. I just have constantly be going back and forth as to what initiative is best. Very, very strict mechanical initiative where actions are influencing the speed of when you are next going to be able to go, and or very, very free form initiative where literally people just say the things that they want to do when it makes sense for them to do it. And I've, I like, I think you kind of really want an order. I think I've landed on. You want to have that time where you actively ask a person, like, what is it that you specifically want to do in this situation? I think that's very important to have. Classic D&D initiative. I dislike that it stops the first 2 minutes of every single combat interaction where you have everyone roll and you spend 2 minutes doing the whole, all right, who got higher than a 25? All right, who rolled from a 25 to 20? And then you're writing down an entire list every time. I tried the passive thing. That was just, it was too stiff. It was too much of the same thing every single combat. I think after exploring Reddit for a while and the RPG design subreddit, I think I've landed on my preferred sort of vision of initiative, which is what has been dubbed the popcorn initiative, which in its most simple form, it is basically literally just, okay, whoever rolled highest for initiative, that's the only roll that matters. You go first. At the end of your turn, you decide who goes next. Now, that very free form style of popcorn, I think kind of just falls into that either old school D&D and or Lancer of, okay, all the heroes go and basically in whatever order they want, and then all the enemies go and basically whatever order they want. Which maybe there would occasionally be something else happening other than that, but I feel like Popcorn Initiative would just be a complicated way of saying, players go, then monsters go. But I've been tinkering around with the idea of doing like a more rules intense version of Popcorn Initiative, which right here you can see that I've written up this sort of flow chart that makes it seem like initiative is very complicated. But in essence, the idea is if player attacks, then an enemy attacks back, and if player does like buff and or non-violent, non-hostile action, then they can make the next player go next. Like that's this whole thing condensed down. This is just sort of the nitty gritty lawyery way of writing this all down for when complicated situations might come up. Which I think generally this would solve, like this would work to basically have that back and forth of like players and monsters fighting each other, and sort of give you that dynamic feeling of the combat that's very unstilted, I hope, while still giving players options. Like you can still play around and potentially strategize and make game plans by deliberately choosing, I'm going to bless this player and then choose this next guy who's going to cast haste on our fighter, and then our fighter is going to on his turn then run in with the bless and haste and do his attacks. I think this involves more thought. Everyone's always got to be ready. You can't really, you don't fall into that like having to make sure people on deck are ready to go next on their turn. Everyone's just always got to be ready to go next because they never know when they're going to get popcorned too. The one thing that I think will get kind of complicated with this, the one hard thing that I'm not 100% sure how to solve, is the effects that last a number of rounds. So, if you have a bless on someone that lasts like, well, we'll say for this example that something lasts one turn. If they go and then immediately go and the effect ends on their next turn, like if they have sanctuary or something, then that gets completely wasted in the fact that their next turn happened immediately. So I think you're going to have to change effects that last until someone's next turn to always last until their next turn, and then not end until the end of that actual round, which this might be messy and hard to track, but we'll see how that ends up working out in practice. Okay, and yep, that is everything that I have got in mind for my next West Marches style campaign. I'm very, very excited for this next one. I think I'm finally landing on some issues to some of the big problems I've had regarding my system and how I really want it to feel and how I want it to work. And yeah, so this next campaign, we're gonna have all three pillars: exploration, social, and combat. We're taking notes from the OG original West Marches style campaign, going back to basics and really gonna do this one how West Marches was meant to be done. Okay. All right. I will catch you guys later.